Friends, and thank you for making it to book 7 of the series of unfortunate events titled The Vile Village. Let us begin. Chapter 1. No matter who you are, no matter where you live, and no matter how many people are chasing you, what you don't read is often as important as what you do read. For instance, if you are walking in the mountains and don't read the sign that says beware of cliff because you are busy reading a joke book instead, you may suddenly find yourself walking on air rather than on a sturdy bed of rocks. If you are baking a pie for your friends and you read an article entitled How to Build a Chair instead of a cookbook, your pie will probably end up tasting like wood and nails instead of like crust and fruity filling. And if you insisted on reading this book instead of something more cheerful, you will most certainly find yourself moaning in despair instead of wiggling in delight. So if you have any sense at all, you will put this book down and pick up another one. I know of a book, for instance, called The Littlest Elf, which tells the story of a teensy weensy little man who scurries around fairyland having all sorts of adorable adventures. And you can see at once that you should probably read The Littlest Elf and wiggle over the lovely things that happen to this imaginary creature in a made up place instead of reading this book and moaning over the terrible things that happen to the 3 Baudelaire orphans in the village where I am now typing these very words. The misery, woe, and treachery contained in the pages of this book are so dreadful that it's important that you don't read any more of it than you already have. The Baudelaire orphans, at the time this story begins, were certainly wishing they weren't reading the newspaper that was in front of their eyes. A newspaper, as I'm sure you know, a newspaper, as I'm sure you know, is a collection of supposedly true stories written down by writers who either saw them happen or talked to people who did. These writers are called journalists, and like telephone operators, butchers, ballerinas, and people who clean up after horses, journalists can sometimes make mistakes. This was certainly the case with the front page of the morning edition of the Daily Punctilio. He always chooses such fun words. I'm saying that sarcastically. I'm going to hate saying that word over and over and over. Just saying. All right. Sorry. Which the Baudelaire children were reading in the office of Mr. Poe. Twins captured by Count Omar, the headline read, and the 3 siblings looked at one another in amazement over the mistakes the Daily Punctilio journalists had made. Duncan and Isadora Quagmire, Violet read out loud, twin children who are the only known surviving members of the Quagmire family, have been kidnapped by the notorious Count Omar. Omar is wanted by the police for a variety of dreadful crimes and is easily recognized by his one long eyebrow and of an eye on his left ankle, a tattoo of an eye on his left ankle. Omar had also kidnapped Esme Squalor, the city's 6th most important financial advisor, for reasons unknown. Ugh. The word ugh was not in the newspaper, of course, but was something Violet uttered herself as a way of saying that she was too disgusted to read any further. If I invented something as sloppily as this newspaper's writer writes its stories, she said, it would fall apart immediately. Violet, who at 14 was the eldest Baudelaire child, was an excellent inventor and spent a great deal of time with her hair tied up in a ribbon to keep it out of her eyes as she thought of new mechanical devices. And if I read books as sloppily, Klaus said, I wouldn't remember one single fact. Klaus, the middle Baudelaire, had read more books than just about anyone his own age, which was almost 13. At many crucial moments, his sisters had relied on him to remember a helpful fact from a book he had read years before. Gretchen, Sonny said. Sonny, the youngest Baudelaire, was a baby scarcely larger than a watermelon. Like many infants, Sonny often said words that were difficult to understand, like Gretchen, which meant something along the lines of, and if I used my 4 big teeth to bite something as sloppily, I wouldn't even leave one tooth mark. Violet moved the paper closer to one of the reading lamps Mr. Poe had in his office and began to count the errors that had appeared in the few sentences she had read. For one thing, she said, the Quagmires aren't twins, they're triplets. The fact that their brother perished in a fire that killed their parents doesn't change their birth identity. Of course it doesn't, Klaus agreed. And they were kidnapped by Count Olaf, not Omar. It's difficult enough that Olaf is always changing his disguise. But now the newspaper has disguised his name too. Esme, Sonny added, and her siblings nodded. The youngest Baudelaire was talking about the part of the article that mentioned Esme Squalor. Esme and her husband Jerome had recently been the Baudelaire's guardians, and the children had seen with their own eyes that Esme had not been kidnapped by Count Olaf. Esme had secretly helped Olaf with his evil scheme and had escaped with him at the last minute. And for reasons unknown is the biggest mistake of all, Violet said glumly. The reasons aren't unknown. We know them. We know the reasons Esme, Count Olaf, and all of Olaf's associates have done so many terrible things. It's because they're terrible people, Violet. Violet put down the Daily Punctilio, looking around Mr. Poe's office, and joined her siblings in a sad, deep sigh. The Baudelaire orphans were sighing not only for the things they had read, but for the things they hadn't read. The article had not mentioned that both the Quagmires and the Baudelaires had lost their parents in terrible fires, and that both sets of parents had left enormous fortunes behind, and that Count Olaf had cooked up all of his evil plans just to get a hold of these fortunes for himself. The newspaper had failed to note that the Quagmire triplets had been kidnapped while trying to help the Baudelaires escape from Count Olaf's clutches, and that the Baudelaires had almost managed to rescue the Quagmires only to find them snatched away once more. The journalist who wrote the story had not included the fact that Duncan Quagmire was a journalist, who was a journalist himself, and Isidore Quagmire, who was a poet. Each kept a notebook with them wherever they went. And in their notebooks, they had written down a terrible secret that they had discovered about Count Olaf, but that all the Baudelaire orphans knew of the secret were the initials VFD. And that Violet, Klaus, and Sunny were always thinking of these three letters and what ghastly thing they could stand for. But most of all, the Baudelaire orphans had read no word about the fact that the Quagmire triplets were good friends of theirs, and that the three siblings were very worried about the Quagmires, and that every night when they tried to go to sleep, their heads were filled with terrible images of what could be happening to their friends, who were practically the only happy thing in the Baudelaire's lives since they received the news of the fire that had killed their parents and began the series of unfortunate events that seemed to follow them wherever they went. The article in the Daily Punctilio probably did not mention these details because the journalist who wrote the story did not know about them or did not think they were important, but the Baudelaires knew about them, and the three children sat together for a moment and thought quietly about these very, very important details. A fit of coughing coming from the doorway of the office brought them out of their thoughts, and the Baudelaires turned to see Mr. Poe coughing into a white handkerchief. Mr. Poe was a banker who had been placed in charge of the orphans after the fire. And I'm sorry to say that he was extremely prone to error, a phrase which here means always had a cough and had placed the three Baudelaire children in an assortment of dangerous positions. The first guardian Mr. Poe found for the youngsters was Count Olaf himself, and the most recent guardian he had found for them was Esme Squalor. And in between, he had placed the children in a variety of circumstances that turned out to be just as unpleasant. This morning, they were supposed to learn about their new home, but so far, all Mr. Poe had done was have several coughing fits and leave them alone with a poorly written newspaper. "Good morning, children," Mr. Poe said. "I'm sorry I kept you waiting. But ever since I was promoted to vice president in charge of orphan affairs, I've been very, very busy. Besides, finding you a new home has been something of a chore." He walked over to his desk, which was covered in piles of papers, and sat down in a large chair. I've put calls in to a variety of distant relatives, but they've heard all about the terrible things that tend to happen wherever you go. Understandably, they're too skittish about Count Olaf to agree to take care of you. Skittish means nervous, by the way. There's one more. One of the three telephones on Mr. Poe's desk interrupted with a loud, ugly ring. "Excuse me," the banker said to the children and began to speak into the receiver. "Poe here. Okay, okay. I thought so. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Fagin." Mr. Poe hung up the phone and made a mark on one of the papers on his desk. "That was the 19th cousin of yours," Mr. Poe said, "and the last hope of mine. I thought I could persuade him to take you in, just for a couple of months, but he refused. I can't say I blame him. I'm concerned that your reputation as troublemakers is even ruining the reputation of my bank." "But we're not troublemakers," Klaus said. "Oh, infuriating, Mr. Poe, you are." Oh, that was a little Yoda. Count Olaf is a troublemaker. Mr. Poe took the newspaper from the children and looked at it carefully. Well, I'm sure the story in the Daily Punctilio will help the authorities finally capture Olaf, and then your relatives will be less skittish. But the story's full of mistakes, Violet said. The authorities won't even know his real name. The newspaper calls him Omar. The story was a disappointment to me, too, Mr. Poe said. The journalist said that the paper would put a photograph of me next to the article with a caption about my promotion. I had my hair cut for it especially. It would have made my wife and sons very proud to see my name in the paper, so I understand why you're disappointed that the article is about the Quagmire twins instead of being about you. We don't care about having our names in the paper, Klaus said, and besides, the Quagmires are triplets, not twins. The death of their brother changes their birth identity, Mr. Poe explained sternly. Mr. Poe. But I don't have time to talk about this. We need to find another one of his phones rang, and Mr. Poe excused himself again. Poe here, he said into the receiver. No, 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 yes, yes, yes. I don't care. Goodbye. He hung up the phone and coughed into the white handkerchief before wiping his mouth and turning once more to the children. Well, that phone call solves all of your problems, he said simply. The Baudelaires looked at one another. Had Count Olaf been arrested? Had the Quagmires been saved? Had someone invented a way to go back in time and rescue their parents from the terrible fire? How could all their problems have been solved with one phone call to a banker? Flynn, Sonny asked. Mr. Poe smiled. Have you ever heard the aphorism, he said. Aphorism, he said. It takes a village to raise a child. The children looked at one another again, a little less hopefully this time. The quoting of an aphorism, like the angry barking of a dog or the smell of overcooked broccoli, rarely indicates that something helpful is about to happen. An aphorism is merely a small group of words arranged in a certain order because they sound good that way, but oftentimes people tend to say them as if they were saying something very mysterious and wise. I know it probably sounds mysterious to you, Mr. Poe continued, but the aphorism is actually very wise. It takes a village to raise a child means that the responsibility for taking care of youngsters belongs to everyone in the community. I think I read something about this aphorism in a book about the Mbuti pygmies, Klaus said. Oh, Klaus, so smart. Are you sending us to live in Africa? Don't be silly, Mr. Poe said, as if the millions of people who lived in Africa were all ridiculous. That's funny. That was the city government on the telephone. A number of villages just outside the city have signed up for a new Guardian program based on the aphorism, it takes a village to raise a child. Orphans are sent to these villages, and everyone who lives there raises them together. Normally, I approve of more traditional family structures, but this is really quite convenient, and your parents will instructed that you be raised in the most convenient way possible. Do you mean that the entire town would be in charge of us, Violet asked. That's a lot of people. Well, I imagine they would take turns, Mr. Poe said, stroking his chin. It's not as if you would be tucked into bed by 3,000 people at once. Snorta! Sonny shrieked. She meant something like, I prefer to be tucked into bed by my siblings, not by strangers. But Mr. Poe was busy looking through his papers on his desk and didn't answer her. Apparently, I was mailed a brochure about this program several weeks ago, he said, but I guess it got lost somewhere on my desk. Oh, here it is. Take a look for yourselves. Mr. Poe reached across the desk to hand them a colorful brochure, and the Baudelaire orphans took a look for themselves. On the front was the aphorism, it takes a village to raise a child, written in flowery letters, and inside the brochure were photographs of children with such huge smiles that the Baudelaire's mouth ached just looking at them. A few paragraphs explained that 99% of the orphans participating in this program were overjoyed to have a whole village taking care of them, and that all the towns listed on the back page were eager to serve as guardians for any interested children who had lost their parents. The three Baudelaires looked at the grinning photographs and read the flowery aphorism and felt a little flutter in their stomachs. They felt more than a little nervous about having a whole town for a guardian. It was strange enough when they were in the care of various relatives. How strange would it feel if hundreds of people were trying to act as substitute bottlers? Do you think we would be safe from Count Olaf? Violet asked hesitantly. If we lived with an entire village? I should think so, Mr. Poe said, and coughed into his handkerchief. With the whole village looking after you, you'll probably be the safest you've ever been. Plus, thanks to the story in the Daily Punctilio, I'm sure Omar will be captured in no time. Olaf, Klaus corrected. Yes, yes, Mr. Poe said. I meant to say Omar. Now, what villages are listed in the brochure? You children can choose your new hometown if you'd like. Klaus turned the brochure over and read from a list of towns. Paltryville, he said. That's where the Lucky Smells lumber mill was. We had a terrible time there. Calton, Sonny cried, which meant something like, I wouldn't return there for all the tea in China. The next village on the list was Tedia, Klaus said. That name sounds familiar to me. That's near where Uncle Monty lived, Violet said. Let's not live there. It'll make us miss Uncle Monty even more than we already do. Klaus nodded in agreement. Besides, he said, the town is near Lousy Lane, so it probably smells like horseradish. Here's a village I've never heard of, Ophelia. No, no, Mr. Poe said. I won't have you living in the same town as the Ophelia Bank. It's one of my least favorite banks, and I don't want to have to walk by it when I visit you. Zouse, Sonny said, which meant, that's ridiculous. But Klaus nudged her with his elbow and pointed to the next village listed on the brochure, and Sonny quickly changed her tune, a phrase which here means immediately, said grouse instead, which meant something along the lines of, let's live there. Grouse indeed, Klaus agreed and showed Violet what he and Sonny were talking about. Violet gasped, and the three siblings looked at one another and felt a little flutter in their stomachs again. But this was less of a nervous flutter and more of a hopeful one, a hope that maybe Mr. Poe's last phone call really had solved all their problems, and that maybe what they read right here in the brochure would turn out to be more important than what they didn't read in the newspaper. For at the bottom of the list of villages, below Paltryville, Tedia, and Ophelia, was the most important thing they had read all morning. Printed in the flowery script on the back page of the brochure Mr. Poe had given them were the letters BFD. Dun, dun, dun. All right, that is the end of chapter 1. We'll continue with chapter 2 very shortly.